They said I should stay at a hotel during the renovations. Too dusty for you, Mom. But when the builder asked who owned the place, he called me by name. That's when I knew. Not when they changed the locks, not when they stopped copying me on the emails, not even when they packed my photo albums into those gray plastic tubs and marked them miscellaneous. No, I knew when the contractor, that kind-eyed man with drywall under his nails and a clipboard thicker than a telephone book, paused at the bottom of the stairs, looked past my daughter and son-in-law, and said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Hallberg, can we go over the plumbing rewrote?" I watched Lisa's face freeze for half a second before stretching into a tight, manufactured smile that didn't reach her eyes. She placed a hand on his arm and said, "We're handling all decisions now. You can email me directly." But it was too late. He'd said it. My name, not hers, not theirs. Mine. I'm 74. I live above a florist shop now. It smells like wet soil and baby's breath every morning, and I've grown used to the sound of the delivery truck backing up at 6:45 sharp. The flat is small, just a kitchenette, a narrow bed with a quilt I made back when my hands didn't ache, and a window that overlooks the alley. There's nothing special about it, and that's what I love. There are no curated design choices, no discussions about open concept versus transitional farmhouse. No one debates the backsplash or complains about grout color. It's a quiet, slightly crooked little place, and every inch of it is mine. The lease is in my name. The bank account it pulls from is mine. And the woman who wakes up here each morning is no longer a ghost in someone else's home. But back then, 6 months ago now, I wasn't living above the flower shop. I was in the house I bought with money I saved penny by penny, year by year, after my husband died. Derek left me a modest life insurance policy and a mortgage I could barely shoulder on my clinic secretary's salary. I scrimped, took on weekend hours, said no to vacations, and yes to hand-me-downs. But I held on to that house like it was the last part of him I could touch. I raised my daughter, Evelyn, there. She had her sweet 16s, her flu seasons, her late-night heartbreaks in that house. Then came her college years, and marriage, and a new name, Lisa. Her husband, Adam, liked the house, said it had good bones. They moved in when she was pregnant with their second. I told them it made sense, that I'd rather have noise and toys and tricycles in the hallways than silence. They insisted on updating things. That was the word they used, updating. As if the hand-painted trim I spent 2 weeks on back in '89 was obsolete. As if the sunroom Derek built by hand with his brother had passed its expiry date. But I nodded, smiled, agreed to things I didn't understand, and told myself, this is family. This is what sharing looks like. Then came the plan. Adam presented it like a business pitch. Blueprints, mood boards, even a digital rendering. "We're going to open it up," he said, like the house was a stubborn old tin of soup. Add a second bathroom upstairs, convert the attic to a workspace, maybe redo the flooring. And we want you to be comfortable, of course. It'll be messy, dusty. We thought, maybe a hotel, just for a few weeks. Lisa chimed in with her bright, brittle tone. "We found a lovely little extended stay with a kitchenette. You'll have privacy, your own space. Isn't that nice?" They already had it booked. Paid for. Non-refundable. I laughed and said, "What if I say no?" And Lisa laughed back, but her eyes didn't. She said, "You won't," and I didn't. The hotel was beige in the way that all corporate hotels are beige. Safe, soft, polite. The woman at the front desk handed me a key card and called me Ms. Hallberg, like I was someone new. The room had a smell, faint but clinging. Processed air, reheated food, the ghost of someone else's perfume. I unpacked 2 suitcases, both of which I'd filled myself. Nobody helped me carry them. Lisa had been on a call that morning, and Adam had forgotten he promised to drive me. I took a taxi, tipped the driver too much out of habit, and climbed 3 flights because the elevator was under repair. No one called to check if I made it. No one texted. I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed and looked at the wallpaper. It had a repeating pattern of birds in flight. I counted them for nearly an hour until the light changed. A week passed, then 2. I called to ask how things were going, if they needed anything. Lisa answered on speakerphone. "Busy," she said. "So many moving parts. Adam's stressed. We'll loop you in later." She hung up before I could ask what "loop you in" meant. I wasn't looped in. Not on the paint colors. Not on the cabinets. Not on anything. Evelyn, my daughter, hadn't used that name in over 10 years. Lisa, with her sleek ponytail and voice like a kindergarten teacher scolding a child, had become the mouthpiece. I stopped calling after that. I spent my days walking around the block, buying small cartons of soup from the cafe across the street, and writing letters I never mailed. I watched the seasons shift from my 3rd-floor window and tried not to count how many weeks had passed. One morning, I took the bus to the house. Just wanted to see it. I hadn't been invited, but something in me needed to look. The siding had already been replaced. A slick white vinyl that made the whole place look like a magazine cover. My rose bushes were gone. The oak tree out front had been cut back into an unnatural, symmetrical shape. The porch swing, Derek's swing, was missing. I felt like I'd stumbled into a replica of my life, built by people who never asked what it meant to me. A construction van was parked outside. I walked up the path, heart thudding, unsure if I would knock. But before I could decide, the door opened and a man stepped out. Tall, wide shoulders, clipboard in hand. He looked at me and smiled. "Mrs. Halberg?" he asked. I blinked. "Yes?" "We've got an issue with the drainage slope under the addition. Need to know your preference before we pour." I stared at him like he'd spoken another language. You're talking to me?" He looked confused. "Your name's on the deed, right?" I nodded, slowly. "It is." He didn't press, just handed me a sheet of paper and pointed to 2 boxes. "Pick one." And I did. Later that day, back at the hotel, I dug through my file box. It was one of those expandable accordion folders, orange plastic, the label faded from years in my hall closet. In the back, behind insurance forms and old tax returns, was the deed. It was yellowed, creased, but there it was. Martha L. Halberg, sole owner. No co-signers, no joint tenancy. Just me. I read it 3 times that night, and each time, my breath grew steadier. They'd called it their house. They'd said, our project, our renovation, our decision. But they'd never asked the only person who had the right to say yes or no. They just assumed I wouldn't. That I'd stay quiet, stay grateful, stay gone. And for a while, I almost did. But then the builder said my name. And that, somehow, was the beginning of everything. It was the letter that made the truth undeniable, though by then I already felt the floor beneath my life tilting. A plain white envelope tucked under the door of my hotel room, the return address printed in neat black type. County Registrar of Deeds. Inside was a notice of a request to amend correspondence regarding ownership. Not a transfer, not a sale, not yet, but an administrative change, as if I had signed away the right to receive property updates and pass that privilege to my daughter and her husband. Except I hadn't. My signature was nowhere on the form, but their names were there in ink, bold as headlines. Lisa Harlow, Adam Harlow, contact owners. I sat at the little laminate desk with the chair that wobbled and stared at the paper until the lines blurred. They hadn't told me. They hadn't asked me. They had simply acted as though I were gone already, as though my role in the story had ended and all that remained was paperwork to shuffle me out of sight. I folded the letter and pressed it flat against the table. My hands were steady, though my chest throbbed with a slow, sick weight. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't a slip. This was intention. And in that moment, a memory surfaced. A conversation from months earlier, casual on the surface but sharp in hindsight. We'd been in the kitchen, Adam flipping through a folder of mortgage documents, while Lisa stood by the stove pouring tea into mugs she never let me use because she claimed my hands shook too much. Adam had said, "It's so much easier if one person handles the correspondence. Less confusing for the contractors, the inspectors. You know how bureaucracies are." Lisa had smiled and added, "Don't worry, Mom. We'll keep everything in order. You just relax." I'd nodded then, relieved to be excluded from what felt like a storm of jargon. I told myself they were protecting me. I wanted to believe in that kind of protection. But the envelope on the hotel desk told me the truth. They weren't protecting me. They were erasing me. That afternoon, restless and aching from sitting too long in the hotel room, I went downstairs to the lobby. The carpet smelled faintly of chlorine from the indoor pool, though no one ever seemed to use it. A woman behind the front desk was stapling papers without looking up. I stood there for a long moment, clutching the notice in my bag, then finally asked, "Would you happen to know if someone can change the mailing address on a property without the owner's consent?" She blinked, surprised by the question, and said carefully, "I think that depends, ma'am. Usually no. Usually, you'd need to sign off." Usually. That word rattled in my ears. I thanked her and walked outside, the autumn air raw and damp against my skin. I stood on the curb watching cars pass and felt like a stranger in my own city. Days later, as if to drive the point deeper, I received another kind of message. Not official, but social. I had gone to the pharmacy near the hotel, a place I'd visited for decades, though always from my old neighborhood, never this branch. While waiting for my prescription, I overheard two women at the counter ahead of me. "Did you hear the Hallbergs sold their place?" one of them said, her tone gossipy, excited. "Lisa said they're renovating before moving in fully, but it's basically theirs now. A total overhaul." The other woman laughed. "Well, thank God, that old house needed a facelift. I'm surprised the previous owner held on as long as she did." They left before I could say a word. I stood frozen with the prescription bag in my hand, my face burning. The previous owner. That was how the world saw me. Invisible, displaced, already written out of the picture. When I confronted Lisa about the address notice, her reaction was quick and polished, as though she had rehearsed it. We met in the driveway of the house, the construction noise rattling through the air. She had her sunglasses pushed up on her head and a phone clutched like a weapon. I held the letter out to her and asked, "Did you do this?" She barely glanced at it before saying, "Oh, that's just a technicality, Mom. Nothing serious. We just thought it would be easier if everything came to us. You know how confusing mail can be." I told her plainly, "It's not confusing. It's mine." And she smiled, that bright, brittle smile she uses on neighbors, and said, "Don't make this difficult." as if my very presence, my insistence on still being a person with rights and memory, was an obstacle in her carefully curated life. That night, back at the hotel, I didn't cry. I wish I could say I did, but the truth is worse. I sat in silence for hours, unable to summon tears. I simply stared at the beige wall and felt a hollow kind of clarity. They had chosen a world without me in it, and they were building it board by board, brick by brick. The hotel room was not temporary. It was a staging ground for my disappearance. And if I didn't act, they would succeed. The following week, I tried to go back to the house. I wanted to retrieve some of my things. A set of photo albums, Derek's old toolbox, the quilt I made for Evelyn when she was 10. The key I had carried for 20 years no longer turned in the lock. Someone had changed it. I stood on the porch with my useless key in hand, the construction van idling at the curb, the sound of drills echoing from inside. I knocked. Adam opened the door, his face tight. "Mom, you should have called," he said. "We're in the middle of demolition. It's not safe for you here." I asked about my belongings. He shifted his weight, looked past me toward the street. "Everything's in storage. Don't worry about it." I asked where the storage was. He said, "We'll handle it." His voice was final, clipped. He closed the door slowly, carefully, like he was being polite. But the latch sliding into place felt like a cell door. I stood there on the porch with my useless key and thought, this is what it feels like to be erased in slow motion. But the real catalyst came the next morning. I was sipping watery hotel coffee when my phone buzzed with a text from a neighbor, Margaret, a woman I'd known for 30 years. "Saw your daughter today," the message read. "She mentioned you'd sold the house and moved south. Is that true? Wishing you well." I read it twice, my hand trembling. Sold, moved. As though I had packed up my life and left voluntarily. As though I were no longer tethered to the address I'd poured my life into. They weren't waiting for me to disappear quietly. They were rewriting the story out loud, telling the world I was already gone. That was the moment the fog lifted. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't generational differences. It wasn't me being stubborn or out of touch. It was betrayal, deliberate and orchestrated. They wanted me gone, not for my comfort, not for dust or noise or inconvenience, but because erasing me gave them control of the property, of the narrative, of the future. I was an obstacle, and they had decided to bulldoze me like one more wall in their perfect renovation plan. And sitting there in that soulless hotel chair with Margaret's message burning on my phone, I made the quietest, sharpest decision of my life. I would not go quietly. I would not be their ghost. They thought they had written me out, but they had forgotten something essential. My name was still on the deed. And names, unlike people, do not vanish just because others decide to stop speaking them. The first signs that my absence was not temporary but engineered came quietly, almost politely, as though erasure worked best when disguised as consideration. When I asked about my photographs, the albums that traced every year of Evelyn's childhood and Derek's smile in softer decades, Lisa assured me with the same practiced brightness she used on shop clerks that they were all taken care of and safely in storage. She did not specify where and when I pressed her gently. She laughed in a way that was meant to be disarming, saying, "Mom, you don't need to stress about boxes. Focus on yourself for once." But I could feel the lie under her voice. It wasn't protection. It was dismissal, the careful redirection of someone who has already decided you no longer need to know. Weeks later, While riding the bus past the neighborhood on my way back from the pharmacy, I noticed through the window that the mailbox in front of the house no longer bore my name. The small brass plate that had read Halberg since the year Derek and I bought the place had been replaced with a shiny new one that said Harlow, as though a quarter-century of ownership had been an error waiting to be corrected. I pressed my hand against the cold bus window and whispered my name under my breath, as though saying it out loud might anchor it back to the brick and mortar I recognized, but no longer controlled. My next attempt to reclaim a sliver of myself was even more humiliating. I went to the storage facility Lisa had vaguely referenced, a chain I remembered advertising on television, rows of steel doors and fluorescent lighting. I asked at the desk if a unit had been rented under my name or perhaps under Adam's. The young clerk scrolled through a screen, shaking his head. "Not seeing anything here, ma'am. Maybe another location?" His voice was kind, but his eyes carried that slight glaze of pity, the kind you reserve for the elderly who misplace keys or forget street names. I walked out without explaining, unwilling to tell him that my life had been packed away without my permission and hidden so efficiently even I could not trace it. The thought gnawed at me for days. Were my belongings really in storage, or had they been discarded, parceled off in garage sales, shredded like excess documents in an office? I would never know. When I finally managed to visit the house again, insisting on just a quick stop to pick up some winter coats, I knew we're still inside. I found the lock changed once more. This time, when I knocked, a security camera above the door blinked red, its unblinking lens studying me as though I were a stranger at the wrong address. Adam eventually opened the door, his smile taut. "Mom, you can't just drop by anymore. There's construction, liability issues. It's complicated." I asked him plainly if I could come in, if only for 5 minutes, if only to see the rooms. He shifted uncomfortably, as though the sight of me asking to enter the house I had purchased outright years ago was somehow improper. "It's just not safe," he repeated. "Let us finish first. We'll make space for you when it's ready." The words "make space for you" lodged deep, because they implied the opposite, that the house was theirs now, and any corner they allowed me would be an act of generosity, not recognition of rightful ownership. After that encounter, my key ring felt heavier than ever, a useless weight. The old brass key to the house still hung there, its edges worn smooth by decades of use, but it fit no lock anymore. I carried it like a relic, rubbing my thumb over its teeth whenever doubt crept in, telling myself that physical keys may be changed, but names on deeds cannot be erased so easily. Yet, each time I touched it, the truth cut sharper. I had been locked out not only from my home, but from my role as the matriarch, reduced to an occasional visitor, tolerated only on the margins. The silence grew louder with each passing week. My phone rarely buzzed, and when it did, it was Lisa forwarding a receipt for hotel expenses with a curt note. "We'll reimburse you later, don't worry." The implication was clear. I was a dependent now, a guest they were supporting, even though it was my account that had paid the original down payment for the house they now claimed as their stage. I scrolled through my call history one night and realized my own daughter hadn't dialed my number in weeks. The last message she'd sent was a reminder about a doctor's appointment I hadn't asked her to schedule. I was not a mother anymore, not even quite a grandmother. I was a responsibility they were repackaging as inconvenience. Small humiliations accumulated like dust. My granddaughter's birthday came and went without an invitation. I found out through a neighbor's Facebook post that there had been a party in the new backyard, balloons tied to the trimmed oak tree, a cake with 3 tiers, neighbors smiling around a table I recognized from my own dining room. My quilt was draped over one of the benches, though it had been presented as just a throw Lisa had picked up secondhand. In that image, shared hundreds of times online, my work, my memory, my presence was there and yet not there. Stripped of authorship, reduced to background texture. Even my finances began to shift in ways that unnerved me. Bank statements no longer arrived at the hotel, though I had set up forwarding. When I called the bank, the representative confirmed that my mailing address had been updated. "Your daughter called to make the change," the woman explained, her tone casual, as though this were routine. I asked if they had a copy of my authorization. There was a pause, then a hesitant, "Well, it looks like we took verbal confirmation. Was that not you?" My throat closed. I whispered, "No, it was not." She apologized profusely, promised to flag the account, but the damage had already been done. My identity was being managed by proxy, without my consent, and each institution seemed all too willing to believe that someone else could speak for me. The worst part was the subtle language, the phrases designed to sound caring but sharp with control. "You don't need to worry about that. We'll handle everything. It's just simpler this way." Each sentence placed me further from the center of my own life. Each reassurance was another brick in the wall they built to contain me, to shrink me into the role of fragile elder who could be consulted selectively, only when it suited them. I was no longer expected to decide, only to endure. At night in the hotel, I lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, and thought about how invisibility doesn't come all at once. It creeps. It seeps into conversations, into the way people pause before answering you, into the way your belongings vanish under the guise of tidying. I realized that no one had called me by my first name in months. Lisa always said "Mom" in that slow, deliberate tone, heavy with control. Adam rarely addressed me at all. To the neighbors, I was already a ghost. To the institutions, I was a signature on outdated forms. Only the builder, that man with plaster dust in his beard, had accidentally pierced the illusion when he looked me in the eye and asked me what I wanted. That single moment of being seen had been enough to remind me that I existed outside their narrative. But with each passing day, they worked harder to dim that reminder, to replace me with a version that suited their plans. And though I sat quietly most days, sipping weak coffee and reading secondhand novels, a kind of steel was gathering under my ribs, a whisper that repeated itself in the quiet hours. "You are not gone yet," and they know it. That was why they moved so quickly. That was why they erased so efficiently. Because as long as my name was still there, printed in black ink on that deed, their control was incomplete. And so, the erasure became bolder. I received a letter from their lawyer, not mine, theirs, suggesting that, for the sake of clarity and future planning, it might be wise to consider transferring partial ownership to Evelyn and Adam. The phrasing was syrupy, full of phrases like easing the burden and ensuring continuity. I read it slowly, then folded it and slid it back into its envelope. The insult was not in the request itself, but in the assumption that I might sign it without resistance, that I might already be so diminished I would hand over the last proof of my existence in that house. I tucked the envelope into my file box with the deed. The contrast between them was stark. One a living testament of my past effort, the other a blueprint for my disappearance. By then, the pattern was clear. They were not waiting for me to die. They were practicing, rehearsing, perfecting the art of living as though I already had. And if I remained still, if I allowed myself to be lulled into silence, soon even I would start to believe it. But silence, I realized, could be a weapon too. So I stayed quiet. I let them think they were winning. I let them speak for me in their clipped, patronizing voices, while inside I was listening, learning, preparing. Because the thing they underestimated most was not my memory or my strength. It was my patience. They thought invisibility meant surrender. They had no idea it was the beginning of resistance. The day I finally opened the deed again, really opened it, and let my eyes rest on the letters of my name without flinching, was the day something inside me shifted, not with fireworks or sudden thunder, but with the slow, undeniable movement of tectonic plates beneath the surface, the kind of change you can't see but feel in your bones. I had carried that document around like a relic, tucked into the back of my file box, glancing at it occasionally like one might glance at an old photograph. Proof of another life, but never letting it become more than a memory. That evening, though, after yet another phone call, where Lisa's voice was sharp with irritation and Adam's silence pressed like a wall, I took the folder from under the bed of my hotel room, spread it open on the desk, and laid the paper flat beneath the pale yellow lamp. It was there, in black and white, the name that no one had spoken in weeks. Martha L. Halberg, sole proprietor, lawful owner of 1847 Oak Ridge Avenue, purchased outright in 1996. My hands trembled not with weakness, but with recognition, as though I were meeting myself again after a long absence. I thought about the contractor, how casually he had addressed me, how natural it had been for him to look at the paperwork and connect the name with the woman in front of him, and I realized how rare that had become, how unusual it was now for anyone to acknowledge that I was not a dependent, not an accessory, but the axis upon which this whole household spun. I traced the embossed seal with my finger, remembering the day Derek and I signed the closing papers, how proud he had been, how we had stopped for pie on the way home because he said ownership deserved sugar, not champagne. I remembered Evelyn's laughter as she ran from room to room that first night, claiming spaces with her small hands, announcing which one would be hers. All of it came flooding back, not as nostalgia, but as validation, proof that what I had built and preserved was real, not a story someone could rewrite without my consent. For weeks, I had been letting their narrative weigh on me like a heavy coat, the suggestion that I was fragile, unstable, incapable of understanding the complexities of property and renovation. I had absorbed it quietly, the way you absorb cold air until it numbs you. But holding that deed, I felt the opposite. Clarity, like fire, returning to frozen limbs. It was not arrogance or delusion. It was fact. They had forgotten, or chosen to forget, that the power they wielded was borrowed, a fragile illusion that collapsed the moment I remembered what was true. The next morning, instead of sitting in the hotel lobby pretending to read magazines left behind by businessmen, I took the bus downtown. I wore my navy wool coat, the one they had once mocked as too heavy for spring, and I walked into a law office whose name I remembered from local radio ads. The receptionist looked surprised to see me, but I asked calmly for a consultation on property rights. Within 20 minutes, I was seated across from a woman not much younger than my daughter, her hair tied back, her expression brisk but not unkind. I laid the deed on her desk. She adjusted her glasses, read silently, then looked up at me with a clarity I had not seen in months. "This is yours," she said, "completely. You never transferred ownership?" I shook my head. "Then nothing has changed," she said simply. Her certainty was like oxygen. I hadn't realized how starved I was for someone to speak to me without hedging, without condescension. I asked about the forwarding address, about the storage lies, about the locks. She explained calmly that none of it affected ownership. "They may occupy it," she said, "but legally, you are the only owner of record. If they've acted without your consent, they've overstepped." I left that office not with anger, but with an anchor. Walking back through the city, I noticed things I hadn't seen in years. The brickwork of the old post office, the scent of roasted peanuts from a street cart, the way pigeons scattered and returned in waves. I felt both smaller and larger at once, as though the world no longer loomed over me, but simply existed alongside me, a place I still belonged to. On the bus ride back to the hotel, I folded the deed carefully into my bag, but this time it was not hidden. It was company. In the days that followed, I began small experiments in reclaiming myself. I stopped waiting for their calls, stopped holding my breath for permission to return. I walked past the florist on Main Street and, on impulse, climbed the narrow staircase above it to ask about the "For Rent" sign in the window. The space was modest, uneven floors and walls painted a tired cream. But when the landlord handed me the keys to look around, I stood by the window overlooking the alley and felt something unexpected. Safety. The smell of soil and cut stems drifted up from below, earthy and alive. For the first time in months, I imagined living somewhere without having to apologize for being there. I didn't sign anything that day. I wasn't ready. But the seed had been planted. I could choose. That was the shift. The house was mine legally, but whether or not I lived in it was a separate decision, and that realization freed me from the trap they had built. They wanted me to fight on their terms, to claw my way back into a home they had already stripped of meaning. But I saw now that true power was not in occupying their stage, but in stepping off it entirely. One evening, as if fate wanted to test this newfound clarity, Lisa called me unexpectedly. Her voice was syrupy, cautious, threaded with the performance of concern. "Mom, we just want to make sure you're okay," she said. "It must be so lonely in that hotel. We've been thinking it might be best to explore some longer-term solutions. Something more stable." I let her talk, listening to the edges of her words, and when she paused, expecting my gratitude, I said evenly, "I'm fine. I've spoken to a lawyer. Everything is in order." There was silence on the line, sharp and heavy. Then she laughed too quickly and said, "Well, of course, we just want the best for you." I did not argue. I simply let the silence stretch, and in that silence, I knew she had understood. The narrative was no longer hers to control. That night, I sat by the window of my hotel room, the city lights reflecting faintly on the glass, and I allowed myself a long, slow breath. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't waiting. I wasn't pacing the edges of a life someone else had drawn for me. I was choosing. The deed was not just paper. It was a mirror, showing me the woman I had been before I was reduced to background noise. A woman who signed contracts, who earned every dollar that built that house, who endured the loneliness of widowhood without collapsing. That woman was still here. And as I watched the dark shape of the florist's shop across the street, I realized I didn't need to ask permission to return to her. It was not a declaration shouted from rooftops. It was a whisper. I repeated to myself as I folded the deed back into its envelope. I am not gone. I never was. And I decide what comes next. It was inevitable that once I had begun to reclaim my voice, they would push back harder. For people who build their lives on control do not simply step aside when the ground shifts beneath them. They double down, they tighten their grip, and they wield every tool they can find to pull you back into the small, manageable shape they prefer. The first sign came not in words spoken directly to me, but in a letter delivered on heavy cream paper with a law firm's logo stamped in sharp black ink. The language was courteous, but the tone was unmistakable. A suggestion, framed as concern, that perhaps it was time for me to consider signing over partial ownership of the property to Evelyn and Adam, in order to ensure continuity, stability, and future protection. It went on about the burdens of aging, the risks of mismanagement, the inevitable decline that comes with the passing of years, as though my life were nothing more than a fragile clock already winding down. I read it once in silence, then again aloud to myself, my voice steady, even as my stomach turned. The insult was not simply in the request, but in the assumption that I would be cowed into compliance, that I would accept their rewriting of the narrative without resistance. I placed the letter next to the deed on the desk of my hotel room, the two documents staring at each other like adversaries. One, the truth of what I had built; the other, the fiction of what they wished to claim. For several nights, I left them there side by side, a quiet reminder that my silence was being mistaken for surrender. Each morning, I woke to see the embossed seal of ownership catching the light, and each evening, I returned to see the lawyer's words waiting like a challenge, daring me to decide which version of myself I would believe. Then came the family meeting. Lisa called me with that tone that brooks no refusal, informing me that they wanted to sit down and talk things through, a phrase that in her mouth never meant conversation, but performance, an orchestrated show in which my role was to be coaxed or cornered into agreement. I arrived at the house to find it strangely pristine, the renovation halted for the day, the kitchen scrubbed and staged as though for an open house. They had placed me at the end of the long table, opposite them, as though I were a guest at my own trial. Adam began with pleasantries, asking about my health in a voice so flat it sounded like a checklist, and Lisa leaned forward with her hands folded, her expression rehearsed sympathy. "Mom," she began, "we've been thinking a lot about what's best for you. You deserve peace, stability, less stress. You've done so much, and now it's time for us to step in." Her words were sugar, but her eyes were steel. I asked calmly, "Step in where? Into a house that isn't yours?" The air stiffened. Adam cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "It's not about that. It's about ensuring that everything is in order for the future. We've already invested so much into the renovations, and it only makes sense for the legal framework to reflect reality." He said it like a man explaining market trends, not speaking to his wife's mother. Lisa added quickly, "We just don't want you to feel burdened. Imagine how much easier it would be if you didn't have to worry about property taxes, repairs, paperwork. We'll handle everything." There it was again, that poisonous phrase. "We'll handle everything." It carried the weight of erasure, of being reduced to a shadow whose presence is tolerated only as long as it doesn't interfere. I looked at them both and said evenly, "I am not worried. The deed is in my name. That is the reality." The silence that followed was sharp, a silence that revealed their frustration at my refusal to play the part. Lisa's smile faltered, her lips pressed tight, and Adam finally said what they had both been circling. Mom, you need to be reasonable. You're 74. At some point, you won't be able to manage all this. I felt the words land like stones, heavy and deliberate, meant to bruise. I let the silence linger before replying. At some point is not today. And until that day comes, if it comes, this house is mine, not yours, not ours. Mine. My voice did not rise, but it carried, and I saw the flash of anger in Adam's eyes, the quick narrowing of Lisa's gaze. They had expected hesitation, guilt, perhaps even tears. Instead, they were met with certainty, and certainty was the one thing they could not spin. After that meeting, the campaign intensified. I began receiving calls from numbers I didn't recognize, voices claiming to be from medical offices I had never visited, offering evaluations, wellness checks, assessments for senior care. When I asked who had requested these services, there was always a pause, a deflection. Once, a nurse showed up unannounced at the hotel, clipboard in hand, saying she had been told I might be struggling with independence. I sent her away, but the message was clear. They were laying the groundwork to paint me as unstable, unfit, incapable of holding what was mine. The most insidious part was the language they used, the way they cloaked aggression in the guise of love. We're just worried about you. You don't want to isolate yourself. It's only because we care. Every phrase was a chain, each one forged from the assumption that care and control were the same thing. And for a time, I found myself doubting again, wondering if perhaps I was being stubborn, if perhaps their narrative had a grain of truth. But then I would return to the deed, to the embossed seal, to the simple black letters of my name, and I would remember. This was not about care. It was about possession. The breaking point came when I discovered, through a neighbor, that Lisa had begun telling people I was transitioning into assisted living. The neighbor, Margaret again, mentioned it casually, as though repeating what she assumed I had already shared. Lisa said you were getting settled into a place where you'll have more support. That must be a relief. I stood there on the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun sharp against my eyes, and felt something inside me harden. They weren't just pushing me out of the house. They were rewriting my entire existence, turning me into a character in their story, a frail figure quietly tucked away so they could shine brighter in their curated lives. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to them, but to myself. I wrote every fact I knew to be true. My name, the date of purchase, the amount I had paid, the years I had lived in that house, the sacrifices I had made to keep it. I wrote about Derek, about Evelyn as a child, about the sweat and the tears that had built that home into more than walls. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the ink smudged, until the words became a litany against erasure. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it inside the envelope with the deed. It was not just documentation. It was testament. Proof not only to the world but to myself that I was real, that my life had weight, that I would not be disappeared so easily. The escalation did not stop there. Adam began leaving me voicemails, his voice clipped and tense, saying things like, "This is getting out of hand, Mom," and "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Each message carried the edge of threat, though always veiled enough to maintain plausible deniability. Lisa's tone grew sharper too, her calls dripping with sarcasm masked as patience. "Mom, I know you think you're standing strong, but you're only hurting yourself. Everyone knows the future is ours. Why resist what's inevitable?" I listened without replying, and in my silence, I discovered something unexpected. power. Their words bounced against the wall of my refusal, and the more they spoke, the more desperate they sounded. But the moment that sealed everything came one morning when I returned to the house unannounced. The workers were there, hauling drywall, hammering beams, and when I stepped inside, Adam stormed toward me, his face red. "You can't just walk in here," he shouted. And before I could even respond, the contractor, the same man who had once called me by name, stepped forward, holding a clipboard, and said evenly, "She can. This is her house. Her name is on every permit. If she tells us to stop, we stop." The silence that followed was electric. Adam's mouth opened, then closed, his anger faltering under the weight of fact. Lisa appeared in the doorway, her expression tight, and for once she had no words. The hammering outside paused, the air thick with the acknowledgement that could no longer be denied. I stood straighter then, feeling the quiet strength of being recognized, not as an inconvenience, not as a guest, but as the rightful owner of my life. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I simply said, "I want everyone out. Now." And they obeyed, because truth, once spoken aloud, has a power even liars cannot override. That was the second escalation. Their attempts to erase me had collided with the immovable fact of my existence, and in that collision, the mask cracked. They had shown their hand, the manipulation, the deceit, the performance of concern, and I had shown mine, patience, clarity, and the refusal to vanish. The war was no longer silent. It was open, and though they believed themselves stronger, what they had forgotten was that all their scaffolding, all their plans, all their control, rested on the foundation of a house that was, and always would be, mine. And I was no longer afraid to remind them. The decision to act came not with a grand announcement, but with the kind of quiet certainty that feels almost like resignation. The way you finally rise from a chair you have been sitting in too long, your legs stiff, but your resolve unshakable. I had spent months in a haze of dismissal and half-truths, told repeatedly that I was no longer central, no longer capable, no longer necessary, and I had let their voices linger in my ears until I nearly began to believe them. But standing in that gutted house, with dust hanging in the air and Adam's fury checked only by the contractor's acknowledgement of my name, I realized that waiting for them to respect me was like waiting for rain in a drought. Respect was not coming. If I wanted space in my own life, I would have to carve it myself. I went back to the lawyer I had met downtown, carrying the deed and the letter from their attorney folded neatly into my bag. This time there was no hesitation, no self-effacing apology for taking up her time. I sat across from her and said, "I want to file whatever needs to be filed to stop them." She studied me for a moment, then nodded, her expression sharp with the recognition of someone who had seen this pattern before. Within a week, papers were drawn. A cease and desist order was prepared, asserting my sole ownership and halting all renovation activity until further notice. The language was precise, cold, unyielding, and it was mine. I signed it with a pen that felt heavier than it should, the ink carving not just letters, but the shape of my return. When the envelope was mailed, a strange calm settled over me. For days I heard nothing, though I imagined the scene when it arrived at their door. Lisa's face tightening as she read the first line, Adam pacing like a caged animal, both of them realizing that their neat story had fractured under the weight of a truth they could no longer contain. I imagined them railing against me, calling me ungrateful, selfish, unstable, all the familiar refrains. But this time, The accusations would not be whispered between them or hidden behind carefully worded suggestions. This time, the law was on my side, and no amount of condescension could alter the black ink of the courts. 2 weeks later, I returned to the house with a locksmith. The sun was sharp, the street quiet, and I carried only a small bag with me. Not because I planned to stay, but because I wanted the dignity of arriving not as a supplicant, but as an owner reclaiming what was hers. The locksmith worked quickly, his hands deft, the old lock tumbling open with a click that sounded like a door unsealing after years underwater. I stepped across the threshold, and for the first time in months, did not feel like an intruder. The air smelled of plaster and paint, of disruption and half-completion, but beneath it, I could still trace the faint ghost of my life. The creak in the third stair, the slant of light across the living room floor where Derek used to sit with his books. Lisa and Adam arrived minutes later, their expressions a mixture of shock and indignation, as though it were I who had violated their space rather than the reverse. Lisa's voice rose first, sharp with disbelief. "What are you doing here? You can't just walk in like this." I turned to her, the locksmith still standing quietly by the door, and said in a voice I hardly recognized as my own, calm and unwavering, "I can, and I did. This is my house. My name is on the deed. My lawyer has already notified you. Renovations are halted. You may leave." The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. Adam stepped forward, his fists clenched, but he stopped short, perhaps sensing that this was no longer a battle of persuasion, but of fact, and fact was no longer on their side. Lisa tried again, her tone shifting, laced with a kind of desperate charm she had once used on teachers and neighbors. "Mom, you don't have to do this. We're family. Think about the children. We just wanted to make things better for everyone." I looked at her, at the daughter I had raised, the woman who now stood before me, rehearsing lines, as though her performance could erase the harm she had inflicted, and I felt a wave of sorrow, but not weakness. "Family does not erase me from my own life," I said. "Family does not change the locks. Family does not sell my belongings without asking. You wanted me gone, and now I am telling you, I am not gone. Not yet. And not like this." I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply turned to the locksmith and said, "Change every lock in this house. Today." Lisa's eyes widened. Adam cursed under his breath, but neither of them could stop me. The locksmith nodded, his tools already in hand, and within an hour the house was no longer theirs to enter. They left eventually, their words trailing off into threats of legal action, of consequences. But I no longer flinched. The paper in my bag, the deed in its yellowed envelope, the cease and desist order stamped by the court. All of it was armor, and for the first time in this long battle, I felt untouchable. When the last lock was replaced, I walked through each room slowly, my footsteps echoing against bare floors. In the gutted kitchen, I touched the wall where Derek's handprint had once left a faint smudge, painted over now but not erased in memory. In the living room, I stood where Evelyn had once opened her Christmas presents, where her laughter had filled the air. It hurt to see the space stripped of what it had been, transformed into a stage for someone else's vision. But it was mine again. Not in sentiment, but in fact. And with that fact came something stronger than nostalgia. Dignity. I didn't stay the night. I didn't want to. The house no longer held the warmth it once did. Too much betrayal lingered in its walls. Too many shadows of conversations that had cut me down to size. but I left with something far more valuable than shelter. I left with the knowledge that I had not been erased, that I had spoken and acted and reclaimed the right to decide. Walking down the front steps, I carried no bags, no furniture, no relics of the past. I carried only myself, upright and unbroken, and that was enough. The climax was not fireworks, not a courtroom drama, or a shouting match in the street. It was the quiet click of a lock, the steady tone of a woman refusing to disappear, the undeniable fact of a name printed on a deed and a voice that finally refused to be silenced. It was the moment they realized I could not be maneuvered like furniture, that my life was not theirs to curate or contain. And though I knew the battle was not entirely over, though I expected the phone calls and letters would continue, I walked away lighter, steadier, certain that nothing they did could undo what had just happened. The return of my own agency, irreversible and absolute. That was the day I understood the truth of power. It is not in shouting, not in demanding, not in forcing others to see you. Power is in naming yourself when others refuse to, in standing in the space they tried to take from you and saying quietly, firmly, I am here, and I will not be erased. I never moved back into the house. People sometimes assume that victory means reclaiming the same walls, setting furniture in the same corners, pretending the years of silence and betrayal can be plastered over like cracks in old paint. But I knew the truth the moment I turned the key in those new locks. I had won back the right to choose, and my choice was not to live in a place so saturated with bitterness. Ownership is not the same as belonging, and though the deed bore my name and the courts confirmed my rights, my heart no longer wanted to rest inside those rooms. The house had become a battlefield, and even when battles end, the ground carries the scars. So I sold it, not in haste, not in anger, but deliberately, as an act of closing. I sorted through what remained of my belongings, the few things that had survived the renovation purges and the hidden storage, and I kept only what mattered. Derek's old toolbox with its worn handles, the handful of photographs I had managed to retrieve, a quilt whose seams were fraying, but whose warmth was intact. The rest I let go of without ceremony. When the papers were signed, when the check was deposited into my account, I felt not loss, but relief. The house had been my anchor for decades, but anchors can also drag you under if you never learn to lift them. I took that money and bought the little flat above the florist's shop, the same space I had once only considered in passing, and this time I signed the lease not with hesitation, but with certainty. The first morning there, I opened the window and let the scent of soil and fresh-cut stems fill the air. It was not the smell of history, not the ghosts of children's laughter or the echoes of a husband's footsteps, but it was alive, immediate, mine. I placed a pot of geraniums on the sill, their red blooms bold against the gray of the alley, and felt a small but undeniable surge of pride. This was not the house I had spent decades defending, but it was the home I had chosen for myself now, without permission, without apology. Lisa and Adam tried, of course, to twist the story even after the sale. They told neighbors I had been unreasonable, that I had made rash decisions, that I had been manipulated by lawyers. They tried to paint themselves as victims of my stubbornness, martyrs who had only ever wanted to help. But their words no longer carried weight for me. Their narrative, no matter how loudly told, could not alter the truth of my choice. When papers are signed and money changes hands, stories can no longer be spun. Facts settle into place like stones. And besides, I had learned the hardest truth of all. I did not need their version of me to survive. What surprised me most in those first weeks in the flat was not the quiet or the solitude, though both were present, but the return of something I had not realized I had lost. The sense of being the author of my own days. I could decide when to wake, when to brew tea, when to sit by the window without feeling like a guest in my own life. I bought a new kettle, not expensive, but chosen by me alone. I rearranged the small space until it suited me, until each corner reflected not compromise but intention. I even bought a tea set, delicate porcelain with blue flowers, the kind of frivolous purchase I had denied myself for decades in the name of practicality. I placed one cup on the table each afternoon and filled it with steaming tea, a cup for the woman I had been too busy or too fearful to honor before. It became a ritual of recognition, a conversation with myself. In time, Evelyn reached out. Not Lisa, not the woman she had sculpted herself into, but Evelyn, the daughter I remembered, fragile beneath layers of ambition and bitterness. She sent me a letter, handwritten, awkward, halting. She did not apologize directly, but she wrote, "I never meant to erase you. I just thought I knew better. I see now that I didn't." I read those words with a heavy heart, uncertain whether they were a true beginning or just another attempt to soften the edges of guilt. I did not rush to reply. Some silences, I learned, are necessary, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and I owed myself the right to choose carefully what bridges I might rebuild and which I would let collapse. The grandchildren, though, found me. A knock at the flat one Saturday morning, two small faces peering up at me, their eyes wide with a mixture of shyness and hope. "Mom said we could visit," the eldest whispered. I welcomed them in, poured orange juice into mismatched cups, and for the first time in a long time, laughter returned to my rooms. They asked about the photographs on my shelf, about the flowers on the windowsill, about the creak of the old wooden floor. I answered each question slowly, letting them know that I was still here, still theirs, not the ghost they had been told I was. And when they left, my granddaughter slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand. Later, alone, I opened it to find her careful handwriting. "You are always my home." That note rests now beside the deed in my file box, though the deed itself no longer holds the same weight it once did. The paper that once bound me to a house is now only proof of a battle fought and won, while the note is proof of something deeper. That presence cannot be erased, that even when others attempt to write you out, the ones who matter will still find you. I sit by the window most evenings, watching the lights flicker on in the florist's shop below, sipping tea from my new set. And I think often of women like me, women told they are too old, too fragile, too inconvenient. Women whose names vanish from mailboxes and whose voices are drowned out by the noise of younger, louder lives. To them I would say what I have learned. You are not gone. Even if they pretend you are, even if they rewrite the story in every room, even if they box up your life and tuck it into storage, you remain. And one day, perhaps quietly, perhaps with the sound of a lock turning or the stroke of a pen, you will remind them. Because survival is not always loud, and dignity is not always recognized by those closest to you. Sometimes it is as simple as a flower pot on a windowsill, a letter folded carefully into a box, or the sound of your own name spoken aloud by someone who still sees you. That is enough. That is everything. and as long as you carry that truth, you will never be erased.